Hello, everybody. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Joining us today is Dr. Al Kertz, and we're going to be talking about the impact of seasonal effects on pre-weaned calves in the southeastern U.S. Before we get into today's session, a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to post those there in the chat area on the right-hand side of your screen. For joining us from social media, simply post your questions directly in those channels. Welcome, Dr. Kertz. Great to have you with us here today.
It's good to be back again this month.
Yeah, well, I'm going to let you get into it.
Well, this is June, and so weather starts getting warmer, more humid. And so that ties in with the subject today about pre-weaned calves. They're very susceptible to weather for several reasons. One is that they have the greatest surface area to body weight that they'll have in their lifetime. Another one is that they don't regulate their body temperature as well, just like human infants. And a third reason is that they have very low body fat, maybe 3 to 5%. That's the lowest it'll ever be. So in the wintertime, that's, of course, much more of a concern than in the summertime. So in the last several years, I've covered a number of studies have been done about seasonal effects, primarily in the summer and heat stress. There's some older ones on cold stress, and some of those are covered in my book. But in this case, what we're going to be discussing is a study that was done at the University of Georgia, Tifton, and that's in southern Georgia near the border with Florida. So it has hot and humid weather during the summer. And what they did was they looked at calves under their research facility, and I've been there. It was a good facility. And they had summertime conditions and wintertime conditions. So if we look at some of the protocol, and I won't go through all of it because it's copied in the article, but they had about 48 calves per season, and about an equal number of heifers and bulls. So there were no biases there. They considered June through August calvings of 2018 as summer, and then winter followed that from November of 2018 to January 2019. And of course, there were calves from their own herd. They separated them from dams within 6 hours, and they fed a colostrum replacer. And actually, in some dairies, they do that, especially on the night cruise, because that allows them to be more careful in doing that rather than having to milk the cow with a milking machine, handle colostrum, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so they did that, and then they fed them 1.4 pounds of a 2617 milk replacer twice daily. There was also another study that was done that's listed, the reference in the article, where they looked at the level of milk replacer feeding. But in this case, we're looking strictly at the two treatments of summer and winter. And so then they were fed all the way through until about 8. And on the 8th day, then they went on these two different measurements. So first 7 days, they're all fed the same. They're continuing to feed the same after that. But on the 8th day, they put them on the milk replacer treatment. And then they continued to feed that until 43 days. And they cut that in half to 49 days. And then they had a full 2 weeks of post-weaning recovery. And I think that's always something that should be included in any calf study. So they had water and calf starter. The starter was about an 18 protein. It didn't say whether it was a pelleted or texturized. I'm not sure which one it was. And then they remained on the experiment until 63 days. Now, if we look at figure 1, the average daily ambient temperature and relative humidity during the summer was 80.6 degrees Fahrenheit. and 83.5% of humidity. During the winter, it was about 55 degrees Fahrenheit and a similar humidity of about 81.5%. So in figure 1, at the top, you see the daily average temperature on the left half of the graph during the summer. And it's above 20 degrees centigrade, which is about where heat stress begins in young calves. So during the summer, they were all under heat stress, temperature humidity indexed, not so much just because of temperature, but because of the combination with the high moisture from humidity. Now notice that in the wintertime, the second right part of the graph, the range of daily temperatures, it's all over the board. Some of them getting up to 20 degrees Celsius and as low as 5 degrees Celsius, but a lot of variation. Now, if we look at the bottom part of that figure, the temperature, the daily maximum temperature during the summertime, you see it's above 30 degrees centigrade. That's that heat stress. And nighttime, it doesn't get much below 20 degrees centigrade. So that's where the heat stress comes from. Now, if we look at the right part of that figure, we see the same thing with the wintertime temperatures. There's a tremendous amount of variation, and sometimes the low temperature during the winter is also as high as the temperature, the high temperature. So there's a tremendous amount of variation, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Now let's look at the next figure. They measured rectal temperature and respiration rates. So during the winter, you see the rectal temperature is lower. It came together week 4, I'm not sure why, but otherwise it's considerably lower than the summer temperature. So the calves are being subjected to heat stress. You can tell by their rectal temperatures. The bottom part of that graph, if we look at that, we see the respiration rate. And the respiration rate in the wintertime is down around 40 to 45, maybe closer to 50 at one point. So that's not unusual. But notice the respiration rate in the summertime. It's up around 60 to 70. So it's almost about 50% greater. So they have higher respiration rate because they're trying to cool themselves. Now, another point is that we know in the summertime, partly due to the high respiration rate, they need more water. So they'll drink more water if it's available and they have access to it. Now, in the wintertime, it used to be thought that, well, calves don't need that much water in the wintertime. But I always tell people, if you see calves, their breath, when they're breathing during the wintertime, that tells you how much moisture they're losing each time they breathe, because they breathe in drier air during the winter, not so much in southern climate, but northern climates. They breathe in drier air into their lungs. They moisturize it when they exhale it. So they lose a lot of moisture during the wintertime, which you may not be aware of. So that's important that we remember that even in the wintertime, they need quite a bit of water. In the summertime, they need even more because of the higher respiration rate. Now let's look at table 1, the growth parameters. 7 days is about when they started the treatment. And they went to 42 days before there was the period of reduced milk replacement feeding for a week. And then they continue for another 2 weeks. So that takes it out to day 63. The daily gains were low, but they were even lower in the winter than the summer before weaning began. And we'll come back to that. That might seem a little bit odd. Then, of course, after 42 days, increased up to about 1.8 pounds, but overall, only about 1.3 pounds or so daily gain. So that's not adequate to double their body weight in 2 months from birth, which is generally the goal. Now, you look at the heart girth, there was a significant increase in the first 42 days during the winter, but nothing after that. Same thing with the wither heights. It was actually lower during the first 42 days for the winter, significant, and then no other significance after that. So there's some difference there, but it's often hard to pick up differences in body measurements in the first 2 months because it's only 2 months of their life. Wither height is probably the best singular measure, or hip heights if you don't have ability to do wither heights. They also mentioned measured apparent nutrient digestibility, and they found it was a bit lower in the summer than the winter. And part of that might be because they ate less starter, or actually they ate more starter and less milk replacer. So it's difficult to do nutrient digestibility's total track when you're feeding a combination of milk or milk replacer and starter, because the starter is quite a variable and that'll pull down the digestibilities. So nothing really that significant there. Now let's look at figure 3. And this is where they looked at plasma glucose in the first section A, upper left-hand corner. And you see that in the summer, plasma glucose was lower than the winter. And to the right of that is insulin. And you see those numbers are fairly close to each other. So why would plasma glucose be lower during the summer? It might be because they had less intake, particularly the starter, because that tends to happen. They usually will drink all the milk replacer, but with the hotter weather and they don't have as much appetite, usually the starter is what starter intake is what suffers. If we look at the bottom 2 sections in C, that's beta hydroxybutyrate. That's kind of an index of what happens in the rumen. Is it fermenting? Normally its function is absorbing butyrate into the bloodstream. And you see the numbers are a bit lower in the summer. And that would be expected if we had less starter intake and less rumen fermentation. Now, if we look at the last section D, that's insulin. Yeah, insulin. And we see that there are some differences, but it's coming and going. And I misspoke. The section right above it is NEFAs. And so you see that they're a bit higher in the winter, in the summer. And that's because if the calves are eating less starter and they still have energy requirement, partly increased because of higher respiration rate, that they may mobilize some of the limited body fat they have, and that's why you would have higher NEFAs. So those are the factors that they found in the study. And what I found interesting was that if we go to the comments section, that in the southeastern part of the U.S., it's not only hotter, but it's more humid. And it's that combination that creates the heat stress for calves, and it does for humans as well. And that's because we don't dissipate heat as well. We sweat more. And so that makes it more stressful for us. Whereas in a hotter climate, but a drier climate, like in much of the West and the Southwest, there's not as much heat stress. And in those areas, a number of them are higher elevation, so it cools more at night. And I've got a study that was done, I referenced in the comment in 2023, where they measured calves and heifers in California versus Florida, and calves did and heifers did worse in Florida than in California because of the difference in humidity. So another factor that was an effect, could be an effect, is that these calves are housed in hutches in Georgia in this study we're talking about now. And they only use sand for bedding. Now that's great bedding for the summer because it's drier and it's cooler. But in wintertime, when you have cold stress, it's better to have deep straw because it creates some insulation value when they lie down. So that was not the case here. And that might have been a factor in why the calves were showing more variation. There's more variation in temperature and why they didn't handle the winter better than they did. So that's kind of a synopsis of the study. It's a really good study that they did because it illustrates a number of these factors, the differences between winter and summer, the heat stress that goes on, and the negative effect of humidity on top of the temperature.
Dr. Kertz, you mentioned humidity. What is the level? What's the percent level of humidity where you start to see some of those impacts? Do you have that? Have you gauged that at all?
I know they say, just watching the weather last night, that when it gets above 50 to 60% humidity, it's becoming stressful on top of the temperature. So if you go to some of the climates where they only have 10 and 20%, you can see that that's not a factor at all. It's a far distance. In this study, both winter and summer, the humidity was about 80%. So that's quite a load. So I guess if we want to summarize the bottom line on this, we know that calves like consistency, just like human babies do. Consistency in their housing, their pattern, their feed, and so on and so forth. And that's probably what happened in this study, why the calves didn't do as well during the winter as we thought they might, because the weather was much more inconsistent during the winter than during the summer, even though the heat stress was greater during the summer. So that's a big takeaway I took from this study, is that, well, if you got winter temperatures, you need to make sure that the calves have a good environment and good bedding so that they're not as cold stressed. And cold stress takes a lot more energy requirement than heat stress. And so it probably has a more negative effect if it's not if there aren't adjustments made. So in this study, that was a big takeaway I took, was, gee, that variation in winter was more of a problem than it was during the summer, even though the summer was more heat stress.
Yeah, which is interesting because you would definitely think the opposite, which is yeah. Well, Dr. Kertz, thank you so much for joining us here today and giving us this update. We always appreciate hearing from you and getting your insight.
Thank you. See you next month.
For those of you that want to dig into Dr. Kertz's column a little more, it is posted there in the chat, so you can link to that, or you can also read it in the June digital edition of Feedstuffs, which will be coming to your mailbox next week. Likewise, we appreciate all of you tuning in. You can watch Feedstuffs 365 sessions in on-demand format on feedstuffs.com. Until next time, for Feedstuffs, I'm Sarah Muirhead.